You're listening to the 7th module of the International Security Online course. In this module, we'll be taking a look at peace support operations, the various forms they take, and the actors involved in them. Looking at peace support operations is a natural extension of where we've left off with regards to mediation negotiation. There you had two states, two actors who were engaged in an active conflict with each other, taking steps to solve that conflict between each other. When we talk about peace support operations, we're talking about bringing in third parties to actively participate in the pursuit of an agreement and in pursuit of making that agreement stick. As opposed to simply negotiation and mediation, which tends not to involve third parties. Peace support operations are directed towards interstate and intrastate conflict, although we see in recent years more of the latter than the former. And especially with regards to the participation of IGOs like the United Nations, peace support operations have become very, very important. Peace support operations usually come in three different forms. In this module, we'll be looking at the first two, which are peacekeeping and peace enforcement or peace imposition. In the next module, we'll take a look at peace building, which is substantially complicated enough that it deserves its own module. So let's begin with peacekeeping. As we've already suggested, peacekeeping is some type of external intervention or participation by a third-party actor, which can be a state or IGO, into a particular conflict, either to separate two feuding parties who are engaged in intractable conflict, usually with the intention of creating some kind of agreement or some kind of stability between them. And oftentimes this is done in support of active negotiation or mediation that's going on between the two sides. Peacekeeping can also be used once an agreement is reached in order to ensure that that agreement has some type of staying power, in order to ensure that that initial agreement, when it's very, very fragile, survives those first few weeks or months when both sides of a conflict aren't prepared to trust each other yet. Ideally, peacekeeping should involve troops and actors that are small in size and temporary in duration. But as we're going to see fairly soon here, this is often not the case. So to define peacekeeping, we'll turn to the United Nations, since they are often the providers of peacekeeping resources. This is, in the slide here, the definition that the United Nations uses to define peacekeeping, and I won't read every word of it, but you can see that it involves, first off, the dispatch of troops from the Security Council. The United Nations can only send peacekeepers to areas that the Security Council authorizes. If the Security Council doesn't authorize it, then peacekeepers will not be sent. If there are peacekeepers there, they are from a different force, a different institution, a different state, whatever it might be. The role of peacekeeping via the UN definition is to essentially do monitoring and observation activities, patrolling demilitarized zones, creating buffer zones, ensuring that two opposing sides that were once in a state of conflict remain in a state of non-conflict. However, peacekeepers are not the essential ingredient to a conflict that has recently ended and preventing it from slipping back into conflict. The UN is very, very clear that the success of a ceasefire, the success of a recently completed conflict, is responsibility of the warring parties and not the peacekeepers themselves, who can only have success when the parties in dispute adhere to the ceasefire agreement. This first point we see in the definition is worth dwelling upon a bit, the idea that UN peacekeepers must be authorized by the Security Council. This turns out to be a fairly high bar to clear because, as I think we discussed a little bit in previous modules, the Security Council can only authorize peacekeepers when there's a majority of agreement within the Security Council and none of the 5 permanent Security Council members, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia, veto the resolution to send peacekeepers. And inevitably, we see that sending peacekeepers can be a very political activity, something that one great power may object to. And so, for example, in Syria, we see a case where the United States and France and Great Britain probably very much would like to have seen the UN send peacekeepers. But Russia, who has taken a direct interest in Syria and Syrian stability, or lack thereof, has vetoed any attempt by the UN to do any kind of real concrete work in Syria. The UN also, it should be remembered, doesn't have any kind of police or independent military force. All UN peacekeepers who wear the blue helmets are essentially armed soldiers that have been loaned by national militaries to the UN for the purposes of peacekeeping. And if there are no states willing to loan out their military forces for this purpose, then there's nothing the UN can do in terms of trying to use peacekeepers in a particular conflict. Usually they can find states willing to loan out military force, but that it's possible that there might be a time when that doesn't exist. Finally, as I already emphasized, the feuding parties have to agree on the presence of UN peacekeepers. If they don't want them there, one side doesn't want them there, then the UN's not going to send them there. Peacekeepers are usually sent by large security organizations like the United Nations, but they're not the only example of a security organization that will send peacekeepers. NATO has sent peacekeepers to Kosovo in 1999. Regional security organizations will sometimes send peacekeepers to conflict areas within their specific region. So the African Union has sent peacekeepers to parts of Africa that conflict has broken out and an attempt has been made to try to create some kind of stability there. Peacekeepers that come from security organizations tend to be fairly limited and restricted in their ability to act, but they also are seen as having a little bit more legitimacy. They tend to be seen as being more neutral in their deployments, which isn't always the case when you have a state sending peacekeepers to monitor a situation. And sometimes in situations where you do have states send peacekeepers, you won't necessarily have consent of all the conflicts of the parties involved. That the state may force or compel some kind of ceasefire or negotiation and will insert itself into a situation in order to forcibly create a situation of peace and non-conflict in order to facilitate some kind of political solution. So what is it that peacekeepers actually do? We can break this down 2 ways. One is the peacekeepers sent after a war where one side is victorious over the other, and there's a need to send peacekeepers to the vanquished state or the vanquished territory to maintain stability after the conflict. So for example, after World War I, you had French troops serving as peacekeepers in the Rhineland after World War I. Many people don't realize this, but part of the Treaty of Versailles was Germany agreeing to have French, for lack of a better word, occupation forces serve as peacekeepers in the Rhineland, that western strip of Germany, after the end of World War I. The objective here was to prevent flare-ups of violence in areas that were bordering the French frontier and possibly lead to the reinitiation of hostilities. Obviously, this is very problematic because many people see this and will say these are not peacekeepers, they're actually conquerors, and this is just the victorious state keeping its troops in the vanquished state for the purposes of political power and exploitation of the victory that's been achieved. For peacekeeping activities where you have an IGO or some kind of neutral party sending peacekeepers, their activities will usually conform to the following activities. First is to observe and verify any treaty or agreement that's been agreed upon by the warring parties. Notice that the duty here is to observe and verify, not to enforce it. If violations of the agreement are taking place, they're simply to write these down and record them. They are not to intervene to enforce any kind of agreement. Secondly, especially in situations where the two sides do not trust each other, peacekeepers can serve as a buffer between the territory controlled by two feuding parties, where neither side is welcome in some kind of neutral no man's land that's occupied by the peacekeepers. Thirdly, providing humanitarian assistance, as conflicts also feature the deprivation of basic human needs and necessities. Peacekeepers can be deliverers of this humanitarian assistance. And finally, peacekeepers can provide the initial stages of a rudimentary civic structure and civil society. Their job is not to rebuild society, that gets to peace building, which we'll talk about later. But even at this early stage, they are things that peacekeepers can do to set the stage for more deeper efforts at peace building later on. For peacekeepers to be successful, they have to incorporate several elements. The first of which is the idea of protecting the general welfare of everyone involved. They are military forces. They deploy violence when necessary, but they're there to ensure that everyone gets along, that the order is stable, that however temporary it may be, and that some kind of return to normalcy might actually come about. Peacekeepers must remain impartial. They can't take one side over the other. They have to be there only when both sides or all parties in a conflict agree that they should be there. And they should usually be what we might call lightly armed, which is not to say unarmed, and sometimes lightly armed might actually be quite heavily armed, depending on the severity of the conflict. But they should always put forth the image of not overwhelming force. They need to communicate both verbally and non-verbally that their presence there is not to use force, but to defend themselves and defend innocents who might be caught up in the reinitiation of a conflict. So that becomes a very difficult task because on the one hand you need to protect your force. Your force needs to be properly armed and equipped. But on the other hand, you can't come on too strong because then it looks like you're occupiers. This usually requires a special kind of training on the part of the soldiers who participate. Your standard issue soldiers are usually trained to see everyone and everything as an enemy that needs to be eliminated, whereas a peacekeeping soldier can't necessarily have that attitude. Yes, they have to be prepared to fight, they have to be prepared to use lethal force, but they also have to be prepared to restrain themselves, because if they do use force in an improper context, that the peacekeepers themselves may result in a reinitiation and a re-outbreak of some kind of conflict. Peacekeeping has enjoyed several successes, especially when it's been done by the UN. In 2005, in the wake of the Darfur massacres in Sudan, you had peacekeepers deployed that more or less prevented the mass killing that was taking place there from getting worse. Yes, it didn't necessarily stop the conflict. That was already taking place before they got there. But once they were there it stabilized the situation, prevented the genocide from continuing and expanding. It facilitated the creation of a new state, South Sudan, which is still struggling to create and maintain any kind of stable government, but it's an improvement over what was there before. And do their best to try to prevent the renewal of conflict. This doesn't always happen, even in a place like Sudan. There's still instability. There are still factions that have shown interest in reinitiating the old conflicts. But generally speaking, peacekeepers did a reasonably good job once they got there of creating some kind of stability in Sudan. Another very interesting example of peacekeeping by the UN, and a successful example, although we could probably question how successful it might actually be, given how long it lasts, is the UN mission to Cyprus. Cyprus is an island in the middle of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. Its population is split between Cypriots of Turkish extraction and Cypriots of Greek extraction. In 1964, Turkey invaded Cyprus ostensibly to protect those Turkish Cypriots, and you had a conflict break out. There was a settlement reached. The UN stepped in with peacekeepers to keep the two sides separate, and they've more or less been there for the last 40 years performing that function. Now, there's not a lot of them there. The lines that have been drawn there have more or less held stable because both sides in the conflict have recognized them and have not tried to transgress them. But there are still UN peacekeepers in Cyprus. That's still an ongoing operation. And so it is a success. But, ultimately, peacekeeping exists to allow two sides the space to come to permanent solutions to conflicts. And in this case, that hasn't happened. The UN has kept the two sides apart, prevented the outbreak of more further conflict, but it hasn't helped, and this may not be the UN's fault, in ending the conflict permanently. In Bosnia, however, we have an example of a failure. The UN was not able to keep ethnic cleansing from taking place once they deployed to Bosnia in the early to mid-1990s. As a result, NATO had to step in and perform a more peace imposition role, which we'll talk about here in a moment, whereas the UN had to more or less retreat, suggesting that as far as the UN is concerned, there are limitations to what peacekeeping and UN-style peacekeeping can accomplish. When you have situations of active ethnic cleansing, you're going to need to do something more than simply observe and report. You're going to have to, if you're intent on stopping the genocide, get actively involved. Indeed, Bosnia raises a series of very similar questions. What happens when peacekeeping isn't enough? Is the UN the only organization that can dispatch peacekeepers? I think we've already established the answer is no. So if the UN-style peacekeeping isn't enough, who else can send peacekeepers, and what kinds of other activities can they engage in? We can look at other examples where these questions emerge. For example, Rwanda, where the peacekeepers more or less stood by when you had a humanitarian atrocity taking place. It should be pointed out that here, many of the perpetuators and initiators of the genocide actually attacked UN peacekeepers, and many of them were killed. So it's not clear what the role of the peacekeepers should be here when you have what looks like a very dangerous and deadly situation taking shape. Which leads to the notion of peace enforcement and peace imposition, where observation and reporting aren't enough and actual force has to be used to bring two sides to the negotiation table, to force them to find some kind of agreement to their conflict. And also sometimes when factions within two sides refuse to acknowledge a peace agreement that the larger parent organization has agreed to. When we're thinking about peace enforcement imposition, the phrase that I think is most effective to conceptualizing this is basically the notion of stop killing or we will kill you. Stop using force or we will use force against you. And again, this has two different facets: peace enforcement, where you have intervention by outside forces against parties who continue to fight, even though the feuding parties or the representatives of these feuding parties have agreed to cease hostilities. And then you have peace imposition, where again you have intervention from the outside in order to defeat one party that doesn't want to make any concessions or make any negotiations. You're not defeating them on the battlefield to vanquish them, you're defeating them on the battlefield to force them to enter into the political situation, to force them to become more political and less military. And right away, we should notice the difference between peacekeeping and peace enforcement. Here, for a definition, we'll cite the U.S. Army Field Manual and their definition of peace enforcement. And notice again, it's about using force or threatening the use of force to get certain parties to desist and cease violent actions. And as a result, you can't be neutral here. You can't simply say, you know, both sides are wrong. You are essentially saying one side is actively sabotaging and actively, by its behavior, its violent behavior, preventing a solution to the conflict involved. So we are going to actively intervene and interfere in their operations in order to incentivize them to make an agreement, in order to end their active participation in the conflict and make them conclude that their interests will come from participating in the political process. Here you can see the two activities placed side by side. Peacekeeping takes place only with the two sides giving the approval, usually, of the peacekeepers. Notice it also needs the approval of the organization that's sending the peacekeepers. Peace enforcement imposition is usually not done by IGOs. It's done by states or more robust security organizations like NATO. And it's done without necessarily both sides, usually not with both sides, agreeing to the presence of that third military force, that third party actively intervening in the conflict. Peacekeeping seeks to avoid engaging hostilities. Peace enforcement has military forces engaging in combat operations. Peacekeeping exists to observe and uphold an existing agreement or truce. Peace enforcement is about compelling one side or the other to make a peace agreement or truce. And because it's a different type of activity, we tend to see different actors engage in this kind of activity. Sometimes the UN will sanction or authorize a peace enforcement operation, but usually the bulk of the force will be provided by a dominant or hegemonic state. Sometimes alone, sometimes leading a coalition. And here you're talking about oftentimes an American type of effort, an American-led effort in places like Iraq, for example. In Kosovo, as we already talked about, it was NATO that participated in the peace enforcement operation, with U.S. participation, but NATO was technically the institution that authorized it. Every now and then you'll get a peace enforcement operation that sees the UN take the dominant and authorizing role, but that tends to be less common than the UN participating in peacekeeping operations. I've referenced Kosovo and the peace enforcement operation by NATO in 1999. Let's take a closer look at that event. In 1999, you had Serbia committing acts of mass killing and ethnic cleansing against the Kosovar Albanians in Kosovo, which at the time was a province of Serbia. The idea ostensibly was to take this land that was multi-ethnic with Kosovars and Serbians and basically kick all the Kosovars out. Part of this was done through forcing people to move, and those who refused to move were killed in large numbers. So to stop this from happening, NATO initiated a bombing campaign and threatened a ground occupation to compel the Serbians to stop their mass killings and to come to the negotiation table to come to an agreement with the Kosovars on the future of Kosovo. This operation did not have UN authorization. It was authorized by NATO. The US and its other NATO allies took part, but it did not have UN authorization. Again, peace enforcement need not have UN authorization. Having said that, we do see examples where the UN Security Council has authorized peace enforcement operations. Turns out the Korean War was a peace enforcement operation. You had a violation of sovereignty, a violation of the UN Charter by North Korea when it invaded South Korea, and the UN authorized force to reestablish the South Korean territorial integrity and compel North Korea to come to the table to negotiate their grievances in a peaceful manner. Of course, North Koreans refused. The US sent troops along with a handful of other American allies to help the South Koreans. The war took place over 3 years between 1950 and 1953 and ultimately ended in a stalemate that exists today, that persists today. The Korean War has never officially ended. You basically had a 60-year armistice. And that's one of the reasons why we're still having talks about and issues with North Korea today, and will they pursue a nuclear weapon or not? Because the war technically isn't over. In Congo in the 1960s, you had a peace enforcement operation authorized by the UN Security Council, one that was, again, very problematic, did not result in any lasting peace because Congo is still a mess today. And in 1990 and 1991, you had Operation Desert Storm, which again was the attempt to stop and reverse the violation of territorial integrity by Iraq against Kuwait when they invaded Kuwait in 1990. And it was here we have a successful peace enforcement operation. The territorial integrity violation was reversed, and Iraq was forced to come to some kind of agreement with the UN, with the international community, that featured them leaving Kuwait alone, although they continue to defy other UN mandates in the coming years. Unlike peacekeeping, peace enforcement operations have a steeper hill to climb with regards to legitimacy, in part because peace enforcement does look like and often does feature actual combat. There's the problem of it actually being more about states realizing their political interests. Think about what war is, according to Clausewitz. War is an extension of politics by other means. And so when states go to war, even under the auspices of peace enforcement, are they really interested in enforcing a peace agreement, or are they trying to realize national interests? Also, from the other side, remember that sovereignty matters, and that a state or an IGO from the outside violating state sovereignty may remove or damage the legitimacy of that peace enforcement operation. These are two very important principles in international politics, and using the justification of enforcing a peace agreement or trying to compel a peace agreement puts these basic norms of international politics at risk. And we'll see this really play out more so when we talk about the notion of the responsibility to protect in a few minutes here. So why do we see so many more peace enforcement and peace imposition operations in the recent years? Basically, three things we can point to. One is the notion of the CNN effect, which I'll detail more in a moment. Secondly, I just referenced this, the emergence of a new norm in international politics called the responsibility or right to protect. Again, I'll go into more detail in a moment. And the idea that peace enforcement is sort of a 21st century or late 20th, early 21st century variation of traditional imperial policing, imperial activity. So first, let's take on the CNN effect. I should preface this by saying there was a time when CNN was considered a legitimate news outlet and is not whatever fluffy, sensationalist network it's sort of become in recent years, where it doesn't show much news, but shows a lot of cooking shows or whatever. The CNN effect in this case refers to the notion that when there are images of humanitarian suffering on the television screen, when there are images transmitted by news agencies and news outlets, especially cable news outlets, which are, operating 24 hours, that the images of this human suffering compel audiences, compel populations in other countries to have their foreign policy apparatus do something about the human suffering. The classic example of this comes from Somalia in 1992, where you have the images of a famine and children in Somalia starving broadcast around the world on CNN and other television stations. And the people who are rightly upset by this call up their congressmen, call up their representatives and say, you need to do something about this. We have the most powerful army in the world. Why aren't we sending food out there? Why aren't we dealing with the warlords who are exploiting these people's suffering? And so that will result in military force and military assistance being authorized to do something about this humanitarian catastrophe, even though it might be very problematic to send military forces into the middle of a civil war, as was the case in Somalia. And notice that in the short term, there was a positive effect in that the famine ended, but in the long term, you had sort of a reverse CNN effect in that the price of stopping the famine and trying to end the civil war was having American soldiers fight and ultimately be killed in places like Mogadishu and Somalia. And the images of those soldiers being killed and dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, compelled the U.S. to abruptly leave Somalia because we're no longer interested in helping starving children. We want to stop our soldiers from dying in the streets of some distant developing world hellhole. Related to this is the notion of the responsibility or right to protect, which oftentimes gets shorted to the acronym R2P. The idea here is that when humanitarian crisis, humanitarian atrocities occur, sovereignty shouldn't be something that protects the tyrants who are responsible for these mass killings, for this humanitarian suffering. Sovereignty shouldn't protect them from consequences for these inhumane actions. And so the international community has a responsibility to prevent these atrocities from taking place. And so thus, military force from third parties is necessary to intervene, to stop the humanitarian crisis from taking place, and if necessary, cause the regime to change, compel some kind of regime change so that the tyrannical, immoral leader is replaced by someone more thoughtful and moral. And this turns out to be this notion of the responsibility to protect has some pretty deep roots. Because after World War II, you had the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, which demanded its signatories intervene in states where genocide was taking place. Now, oftentimes, the international communities failed to abide by this treaty, but it does exist, and thus the norm exists as well. Finally, from the more critical perspective, is the idea that peace enforcement operations are essentially the way dominant states, one might even say imperial states, police those parts of the country, or parts of the world, I should say, that they don't have a particular interest in developing, or the economics are such that there's no compelling reason to develop it economically, but on the other hand, you don't want these chaotic and ungoverned or underdeveloped areas being a threat to international stability, so you engage in peace enforcement and peace imposition operations to sort of ensure that these areas of disorder and chaos don't spread to areas where there is order and stability. Think of it as sort of like parts of a city where there's a lot of crime and there's not a lot of economic development to sort of raise and raise the economic fortunes and opportunities of the people who live there. So the alternative is to have a heavy police presence to deal with the crime that takes place there. It's the same basic idea here, that you're sending in military force to police areas of underdevelopment to prevent the underdevelopment from spreading, the disorder from spreading, and ensuring the safety of the rest of the world that's more developed and more rich and wealthy. Any notions of human rights in this framework are purely window dressing. And we can conclude here by briefly looking at the effectiveness of peace enforcement and peace imposition operations. Generally speaking, we see mixed results. In places like Kuwait and the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, peace enforcement has been successful. In places like the Korean War, you've had some success in the sense that it stopped the war from taking place, but the conflict still persists to this day. So it's not like Cyprus, it's not necessarily a success if it persists for so long. And you have the case of the former Yugoslavia, where, as we saw with peacekeeping failed, so peace imposition was brought in. And that, again, stopped the genocide and the killing from taking place, but it also, the cost of that was to impose these partitions, these ethnic partitions that are now sort of their own states in an area where multiculturalism and sort of different ethnic groups living together had been the norm in the past. And again, you solve one problem in the short term, but you create a new problem in the long term that you maybe didn't need to have to create. So again, the results are oftentimes very mixed, but again, these are very difficult situations.